Okay. Thanks, Heidi. Hi, everybody. Tom Hitchings. I'm here today to give you my answer to this question: does the UK need a new clusters policy? And my answer is no. If we're talking about the active, direct promotion of clusters, I don't think that's what the UK needs. However, what I will argue is that if we look at the existing policy areas that we have in UK government, whether it's education or transport or infrastructure, I think there are things we can do in all of those policy areas to give them more of a cluster flavour, give them more of a cluster flavour, and that is, I think, what the UK needs. So that's going to be kind of the conclusion that I'm going to present to you at the end of this. A bit of background, because I see most people actually in here, I don't think I've come across during the time that I was researching here at BIS. So I've just finished an MPhil in public policy, and as Heidi says, one of the components of that course was a piece of research I did with the cities and local growth units. And so there's a written report which hopefully you've had the chance to look at, but if not, I'm sure we can get copies sent out to you. And then this is going to be a short kind of snapshot of what I found and the kind of lessons I learned along the way. So what I agreed with people like Heidi and the other people that I worked with directly on this piece of research was that I should answer 5 questions. And really I tackled them chronologically, and I'm going to present them to you chronologically as well. So the first one is, what is a cluster? We've already used that word about 10 times today, but what is it? Once we know what it is, then the next one is, what's a successful cluster? So what success criteria can you use to judge whether a cluster is functioning like a cluster? And also, by inference from that, are they worthwhile? Is this something the government should be interested in promoting and seeing more of? The third question then was to go away to look at some case studies, which I did, and what lessons I could draw from those case studies, and then feed that into the fourth question, which is to come up with a model for how clusters form. Now, there's lots of these that are already in existence in kind of the academic research world, so I've tried to come up with a model that was based on like case studies, which we can then kind of look at in comparison to the academic models and see where there are similarities and see where there are differences. Finally, and most importantly, I've made some recommendations for what I think the government should be doing going forward in this Parliament. And so what I'll do is I'll probably give you a couple of minutes on each one of these 5, maybe a bit more towards the ones at the end, which are slightly more important, and then I'll hand over to Mark for his response. Okay. So the first question is, what's a cluster? So clusters are one of these things where people can already kind of know where they are, and they can point to them perhaps before they understand or they have a definition that they've worked out to describe them. Of course, the best known cluster is Silicon Valley, and I can tell you, having read 100 articles on clusters over the last 6 months, that there isn't a single one that doesn't mention Silicon Valley. So it's extremely prominent in the research, although really in many ways you could argue it's the exception, because it's unlike other clusters simply down to its size. It really is a big cluster. If you think that Cambridge is often described as maybe the UK's version of Silicon Valley, then if San Francisco was Cambridge, San Jose down here would be South London. It's a much bigger cluster than certainly anything we have in the UK. But Silicon Valley is, of course, the original and the archetypal one. A couple of other interesting ones. Digital Media City in Seoul is a fantastic cluster for consumer technology. What I find so interesting about DMC is that not only do you have manufacturers and designers of consumer technology based in Digital Media City, but consumers, people that love technology in South Korea, choose to live there just so that they can be around the kind of the atmosphere and the exhibition centres, that kind of thing. The Dutch flower industry is also a highly successful cluster, and one of the reasons why it's a good example of clustering is because people that understand flowers better than I do will tell you that the geography in the Netherlands isn't actually fantastic geography for growing flowers. There are other places which are more suitable, not to mention having cheaper labour. But it continues to have over 50% of the global export market for fresh flowers on the basis of the retained knowledge in the area in the Netherlands, which has enabled this cluster to continue to thrive in spite of globalisation. So those are great examples of clusters. In terms of how we define it, this is the definition that I settled on. So a cluster is a local concentration of interconnected firms and institutions of national significance. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the kind of machinations that we went through to come up with this definition, but the sorts of questions you need to think about when you're thinking about what a cluster is is it a single industry or a multi-industry phenomenon? I think it's really important that you think of clusters as multi-industry phenomenons, because one of the great things that they can do, and one of the great things I think from the government's perspective they can offer, is the potential to transfer technology and expertise from one industry to another. So I think it's a multi-industry thing, which is why I'm using this idea of interconnected firms and institutions. I think it's worthwhile also to make sure we have a very broad definition that can include supply chains, Because if you talk about, say, a cluster of automotive firms, yes, let's look at the car manufacturers front and centre, but we should also look at the furniture companies that build furniture to install into cars as well. So we want a definition that captures the supply chain. A couple of other things to think about, which I won't go through. Just the last one I'll touch on is, I've written here, dominance of Porter thinking. So this is a reference to Michael Porter of Harvard Business School, who coined the term clusters at the end of the 80s, and really is, by quite some margin, who would you expect from Mark, one of the most prominent academics that talks about this subject. And what I would say about Michael Porter's work is that it's excellent, and I think he does a very good job of kind of telling people what clusters are and defining them, but it's just important to know that his conclusions in terms of what government should do are actually very controversial. So any kind of research on clusters, you just need to be very careful that you don't fall into the trap of the Michael Porter school of thought, which at the top end, in terms of defining things, is very consensual, but when you get down to his analysis, I think it's a lot more contentious. So that's what a cluster is. What makes a successful cluster? Why are they kind of good things? Well, three things really come out of the research more than others that I think are valuable to government and why they should be promoted in some form or another, and that's the impact they have on productivity, innovation, and employment. I go through these in the reports, I'm not going to talk through them now. The one thing I will say is, I assume most people here are civil servants, you probably have a better understanding of the policy agenda over the next 5 years than I do, and what's likely to be driving decisions. I think the potential impact of clusters on productivity is what can make them really relevant in this Parliament, because as I understand it, it's a known issue now in the UK that our productivity level is a problem. There's been negative productivity growth in some of the last few years, particularly when the recession was on. And clusters are a great opportunity, the evidence would suggest, to boost productivity if you can get them to work. If you look at this first finding here, from Ciccone in 2002, that doubling employment density when you control for other things is found to have a 5% productivity gain. Doubling employment density, 5% gain. It might sound quite small, but of course a 5% gain to productivity is a really big deal, particularly when you've experienced negative productivity growth as we have in some of the past few years. So I think productivity is one of the big reasons why clusters are a really important thing to be looking at now. I asked also civil servants, many of the people in this room I think, why they think clusters are valuable, and in terms of their characteristics they came back with many of the same reasons of what the research has shown, as in the potential to increase innovation, to improve our competitiveness, and to encourage FDI. What was more interesting is this kind of graph on the right-hand side, where I also asked people to say if they had a preference for what sort of industries you'd like to see clusters in the UK, if in an ideal world you could almost pick and choose. And what you see is real differences between different industries, from biotech at the top and automotive, down to investment banking at the bottom, and tobacco at the bottom and investment banking down there as well. So there's clearly some kind of value judgment going on here, which I'm not going to question, but I did use them to inform which ones I looked at for my case studies. But this might be also something to think about when you're defining a cluster, is do you also have an industry preference as well? The one caveat I would put on this is that something that came out of my research is that it's very clear that some industries cluster better than others. And biotech certainly does cluster, but it doesn't cluster as naturally as, say, engineering or software development. Biotech firms can be quite insular, and employees don't mix with employees of other companies as much as engineers do, for example. So although a biotech cluster is very desirable, we've seen that before when RDAs have been asked to look at clusters in their local area, and they all came back and said they had biotech clusters. It kind of shows you that this is a case of politics starting to trump economics, which is a theme that I'll come back to. So I went away and looked at 3 case studies, which were the high-tech industry in Cambridge, Motorsport Valley in the Midlands, and the ICT industry in Ipswich, which is centred around a Dashwood Park, which is BT's research base, just outside Ipswich. The reason I picked these 3 was to have a spread from, at the one end, a very successful cluster by most accounts, which is Cambridge, to Motorsport Valley in the middle, which is I would describe it as a very successful cluster, but currently of quite limited scope, but with very interesting potential to expand. And then a Dashwood Park at the bottom, or Ipswich I should say at the bottom, which, if I may be blunt, is an example of a cluster that hasn't taken off. And it's interesting to think about why that is, despite the fact it's had a lot of support from local government and from the main company that's in the region. So for each of these case studies I looked at, I I went out and I spoke to lots of people, mostly in the private sector, but I also spoke to people in local government and venture capitalists, fund managers, that kind of thing. What I tried to do with my research in the report is for each one of those 3 case studies, give you an answer for why did this cluster come into being, what triggered it, how is it characterised today, what makes a cluster different from a city or any other kind of zone of economic activity, and then what are the challenges that it faces going forward. That's a snapshot of my findings, and there's obviously more detail in the report. I don't think I want to go through it all now, because that's maybe what the report is for. So I thought what I would do instead is, from each one of the case studies I looked at, is I'd just give you 1 or 2 graphs and charts that I made along the way, and each kind of tell a different story, and I thought I would just summarise those for you now. So each case study in a chart or 2. So firstly, Cambridge. So this is a diagram that shows you the lineage of a number of startups or new firms that were created in Cambridge between 1960 and 2010, using Cambridge consultants as kind of the grandparent, if you like, of the family tree. And what I'm trying to just show here, I hope the diagram is kind of self-explanatory in terms of what it means. What I'm trying to show is one of the things you get in Cambridge that you don't see in other places is this startup mentality and the willingness of companies to embrace spin-outs and new ideas being taken outside of the company to promote new sources of growth and new commercial successes. Many people in Cambridge who have worked in London have told me that this kind of thing you wouldn't see in London, that firms would be much more keen to retain the innovation in-house, and that in Cambridge there's a much more open attitude to spinning it out into a separate company, which maybe some of the originators would then take ownership of. But it's the sort of characteristic that you just don't see quite as much in London. And that's critical to the success of the Cambridge cluster, and it also continues to attract new people to the area. Another one I wanted to put up here is just 4 individuals and where they collaborated on startups that have come along over the last 40 years or so. And just the point of this diagram was to emphasise something that I saw across all of my case studies, which is that as much as you look for trends and factors and causes for clusters, there's a large extent to which it's just having the right people at the right time. And these 4 individuals, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, but they're 4 individuals that, as evident, they're not all friends. Some of them even got into fights, but they collaborated on a number of different projects, and it's having those right people there really had a big impact in Cambridge. Moving on to Motorsport Valley, this is a diagram that just shows you the location of 20 leading companies in the motorsport industry. Now there's kind of 2 points and 2 reasons why I wanted to show this to you. The first is just to emphasise the strength of the UK in motorsport industry, and the number of firms in the UK compared to other countries around the world. The UK really is a world leader in motorsport, and it's something that's increasingly recognised, but it is certainly something to shout about. But the real interesting thing about this diagram is if you don't mind looking beyond the numbers at the names of the companies that I'm pointing to here. When you look in the UK, you see, these are mostly Formula 1 teams, but you see Force India, Lotus, Marussia, McLaren, Red Bull. And then when you look in Europe and America and Japan, what names do you see? You see Honda, Audi, Nissan, Porsche, Toyota. So the big difference there is that in the UK what you have are independent companies, largely independent companies, and what you have in other countries are OEMs, car manufacturers. And that really is actually the key to the success of Motorsport Valley in the UK, which is that to do well in motorsport, what you need is the capability to rapidly come up with an idea, design it, prototype it, build it, and then put it on the racetrack within months, if not weeks. And the way to do that is not to be an OEM that's locked into a supply chain inherited from the parent company that forces you to use certain suppliers, but to be an independent, horizontally integrated business that can just work with different suppliers as and when. 1 year working with one company, 1 year working with another company, perhaps to provide gearboxes or powertrains, that kind of thing. The other thing you get with such a large concentration of firms, rather than say Northern Italy, where kind of everything is centred around Ferrari, is you get much more movement from firm to firm, which again is critical to success in the industry because you need to have intellectual property from your competitors in order to be able to keep up with them. And that process goes on quite openly. And having that kind of market structure in the UK, which they don't have in Europe or Japan or North America, is one of the key reasons why the UK has been successful. And there's really no better illustration of the fact that Mercedes have their bases in Brackley and Brixworth, and they have no meaningful motorsport presence in Formula 1 at least in Germany. So that was Motorsport Valley. The last one was Ipswich, which, as I say, is an example of a cluster that hasn't really taken off. Now, the background here, because most people I know won't be familiar with it, is there is a site in Ipswich called Industrial Park, which used to be called Post Office Park, and it used to be an RAF base, and it's long been a kind of centre of communications technology, and it has real strengths in communications technology. And lots of big firms, like Huawei and Google and Acer, have established a presence on Industrial Park, because now BT are there, and they are essentially looking to feed off the research that BT does and to win follow-on work. What BT have been doing over the course of several decades now with local government is trying to promote it as a cluster, a world-leading cluster for communications technology. Now, arguably, it's already a bit of a cluster to an extent, but if you look at the metrics, it's a small one and it's not particularly successful. You've got, if I remember off the top of my head, 5,000 people employed there, of which 4,000 are employees of BT. And despite all sorts of things, they brought in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who set up a research institute there about a decade ago, and then they pulled out a couple of years ago. All these initiatives, and it's never really taken off the ground. And what came out to me from kind of talking to people and looking at it in more detail is this really comes down to a fundamental skills mismatch. And in my opinion, this is an example of a cluster that goes against the grain of local economics, and that's why it hasn't really taken off. So the sorts of jobs they have at Industrial Park are looking for people with, certainly an engineering degree, if not a master's degree in engineering, maybe 5 years of experience in relevant industries. And the local labour force isn't able to provide that. And many of the employees that work there come from London and other places. And I think that's a big reason why the cluster in Ipswich hasn't taken off. There's another great illustration of this, well, maybe great isn't the word, but in that region, you're very close actually to Folkestone Port, where they run an apprenticeship scheme. And they also run an apprenticeship scheme at Industrial Park. And the Folkestone apprenticeship scheme gets inundated with applicants. They're oversubscribed by a factor of something like 10 to 1. Whereas at Industrial Park, they really struggle to get enough applicants to fill the places, never mind enough qualified applicants to fill the places for apprenticeships. And I think what this is pointing to is you have a region where there's a strong demand for apprenticeships, and there's a company, a good company that's offering them, and they're not getting the right number of applicants in. And it's to do with the local economy and there being a bit of a mismatch between what the local economy provides and what the cluster is seeking to, what demand the cluster is seeking to service. So solutions to this problem very much have to focus on things like education and infrastructure, and far less promotion from central government. Okay, so those are the three case studies that I looked at in a little bit of detail. What I tried to do, having gone through those case studies, is then answer the fourth question, which is, well, what does this tell us overall about clusters and how they work? And because my day job is as a management consultant, I tried to come up with a nice, really simple kind of three-point plan to tell you in government the things that you would need to do to promote clusters. Unfortunately, I failed completely at that. And even when I kind of simplified things down and I boiled things down as much as I could, and I looked for all of the things that were common, what I kind of settled on is there are at least 6 factors that need to be in place for a cluster to form and to grow. And they are the top ones, the primary factors along the top, that you need a very favourable business environment, knowledge environment, and technology environment. And you can kind of see in the bullet points here the sorts of things that I'm talking about there. And that when those fundamentals are in place, you also then need a sound financial environment, an attractive built environment, and a few other conditions for it to be able to get off the ground. Now, I appreciate that this is not a simple model, it's certainly not a three-point plan for how can you create clusters, how can you kind of encourage them to grow in one area or another. And I considered just trying to kind of make it simpler and nicer to look at. But I think in its complexity, or at least I hope in its complexity, it serves a kind of wider point, which is that it illustrates that there's no single lever, there's no silver bullet that you can pull to create a cluster. They're the result of many different factors, many of which are kind of historical things, local factors, and there's no way that the private sector or the government can just create a cluster. It's a much more historical thing than that. The other thing that I hope this shows is that although I've got 6 factors on there, which you might say is more than you need, or is too many rather, none of them are public policy. So there's no policy lever either that you can pull to just create a cluster. The final reason why I wanted to kind of leave it with this kind of relatively complex model is that the main models you see in academia, if you take, for example, Michael Porter's diamond model, which I won't go into, but it's like a 4-point model to explain the formation of and growth of clusters. Many of those models, I think, it's a bit like perfect competition in economics. They're a bit too simple. Michael Porter says if you have all of these conditions, then you've got the right sort of situation for a cluster to develop and grow. But I think what those simple models miss out is that for policymakers and for people like you in government, there are really difficult decisions you have to make, and often the factors that you're appealing to are in conflict with one another, which doesn't, I think, come out of Porter's model. So, for example, the 3 case studies that if I talk about Cambridge and Motorsport Valley, the 2 kind of highly successful case studies I looked at, I interviewed across the 2 probably about 30 people, and about 20 of them said to me, the biggest barrier at the moment to the growth of this cluster is high house prices. So it's nothing necessarily cluster specific, it's a general concern, but that's the biggest barrier to the growth of those clusters at the moment. So affordable house prices are a really important part of having the environment to develop the sorts of clusters that I looked at in my case study. And what you need to capture, I think, in any model is that you have elements on here that are often at odds with each other. So if you want to have an attractive business environment, technology environment, and knowledge environment, let's say you want strong transport connections, you want coffee shops where people can meet, meeting spaces, you want a pleasant town centre, you want to attract people in to join the cluster and to participate in it. That may be at odds with affordable house prices, if it means rapid development, if it means you've got to be putting car parks in and things like that. And we need a model that's complex enough to recognise that policymakers are often going to have to make quite difficult trade-offs between competing demands. So what should government do? Well, firstly, I don't think government should have a clusters policy, in the sense that I think there's little academic evidence to support it, and certainly the case studies that I looked at, the cluster succeeded not because of government. Government played a supporting role. And the idea that active and direct support for a cluster from government is going to enable you to create one, I think is totally unrealistic. There's also, of course, the risk that it would be taken hostage to other objectives. So, very worthwhile policies that are either redistributionary or designed to encourage economic development. If you had a clusters policy, then there's obviously a risk that it would be used to serve those goals as well as just trying to promote clusters. And I think that would be dishonest and ineffective. So instead, what I think you need are cluster-orientated policies. So looking at the existing policy areas that are already on the agenda, transport, migration, housing, universities, research and development, access to finance, as you kind of go across these policy areas, what you find is that there are some where the policies you have in place at the moment have a real big impact on the growth of clusters. And it would be worthwhile at this end of the spectrum, giving these policies a bit more cluster thinking, a bit more of a cluster flavour to them, to help the growth of clusters, rather than having an outright approach of promoting them. Other things like health and pensions obviously have a low impact on clusters, but some others are quite influential. So with that kind of framework in mind, here are kind of 3 steps to finish that I think you could take to encourage clusters over the next 5 years or so. So firstly, I think every cluster should have a strategy, by which I mean a publicly facing vision of where the cluster is going to. So where is its future growth going to come from? And then what impediments are stopping them from getting there? So for example, in Motorsport Valley, you can speak to anyone in Motorsport Valley and I'm sure they would tell you the vision for Motorsport Valley has to be about taking the expertise they have in motorsport and the ability to rapidly prototype and develop engineering solutions and transferring that to other industries like transport and defence and just the regular car market. That would be the vision for Motorsport Valley. And I think what we need to do is let the private sector come up with these strategies rather than government initiating this process. Partly to give credibility, but also because clusters naturally have these kind of industry associations that develop, which are capable of pulling it together. And then once you've got those strategies, what you need to look at is what are the impediments that stop you from getting there. And some of those will be things that businesses need to work out solutions to, but many of them will be things where policies have a direct impact. And what I would argue is the government can make a few subtle changes to some of its policies that wouldn't harm the intended objective of them, but would do a lot to help clusters grow. So here's the second step. I'll give you one example of feeding back information from the cluster strategies into the existing policy framework. We take higher education and university funding as an example. The current research excellence framework that determines how much research funding universities are given from central government places a lot of emphasis, most of its emphasis, on getting articles published, and a little bit of emphasis on ideas from universities being spun out into business and into commercial success. However, the criteria that it uses are kind of very strict. Really what you have to do is come up with an idea, publish an article on it, turn it into a patent, and then commercialise it. If you can do that, then the central government will reward your university with some funding for achieving commercial success through its research. But really, the way that innovation, particularly in industries like engineering, works is not like that. You get different ideas that come together, and people bring different ideas together, often coming out of universities, and that can spawn innovation that spawns commercial success. But the criteria that's used to allocate funding to universities at the moment is not wide enough or generous enough to be able to capture that. And so instead what you get are academics in engineering departments, for example, channeling their research much more into getting articles published. And I think it's a bit of an open secret that many of the articles published are done for this purpose and don't serve a much wider benefit. And it's pushing time away from things like exploiting ideas out of universities for commercial gain. I have a few other suggestions that I've written in my report. The final step I think is really important is devolution. And there's a couple of points here, but I'll just focus on the last one. Particularly in the case of Motorsport Valley, if I think back to the conversations that I had with people and the things that they said government could do to really make a difference, when I asked them, you've got all these challenges, what can government do to help the cluster grow? One of the big things that came up was restrictions on immigration and difficulty getting highly skilled people from outside the European Union to come to the UK to serve a very clearly understood need and a gap in current labour markets. So a great example of this in Motorsport Valley is the manufacture of carbon fibre composites, which is basically for chassis for vehicles, where Northern Italy is a long way ahead of the UK at the moment. And there are people in North America, Australasia, East Asia, that we could potentially attract to the UK. And it would only need to be a small number, maybe 50 or so. But if they could come to Motorsport Valley and bring that expertise from overseas, on top of what we're able to achieve already through the current migration rules, people have reported back to me that would have a really big impact. So something that I think would make a lot of sense, although it would certainly be a little bit controversial, would be to devolve certain migration powers to local government, to cities. So for example, give a local government a quota of 200 visas that they can assign to skill categories that they agree with local firms in their area, and they can use to fulfill demand for labour that's very specific to their local economy and which really only local government would ever be in the position to identify, because by the time you get up to Whitehall, some of the subtleties in terms of what's required from firms and clusters may be lost. So that's one suggestion. Also, more freedom for local government to work on infrastructure I think would be very important as well, because certainly in the case of someone like Cambridge, the difficulties they face building new houses and building new towns, like Northstowe, for example, have been extremely severe. And bluntly, what you need is to build on a bit more of the green belt. And really, the only way to make that kind of decision acceptable is through local government. I think it would be very difficult to do through Whitehall. So those are 3 steps that get you on that direction that I'm recommending, which is that we should be promoting clusters. They're a good thing, and they help us in a number of ways. They're the result of a perfect storm of environmental factors, so government can't just create clusters, but it can certainly create the conditions in which they thrive and grow. And my 3 recommendations, 3 steps that I think government should take, is firstly to work with the private sector to come up with strategy documents for clusters. Secondly, to remove impediments, so the example I gave of higher education funding. And thirdly, to give cities and regions more power over economic development and immigration policy, so that they can bring in more people to the clusters that the labour market is asking for.